Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum MacDonald. Hello. And this is Geoff Aberdeen, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy McKeever, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
And we're dropping in with a flash reaction episode after the defection of Lord Offord, Malcolm Offord, from the Conservative Party to Reform UK. Malcolm Offord, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, guys. Good morning.
Great to have you with us. How's your weekend been?
Medium-sized?
Tell us about the defection, Malcolm. What has motivated your move from the Conservatives to Reform UK?
Well, the first thing is not done lightly or easily, and done, frankly, with a heavy heart and a certain amount of reluctance. But I suppose life's a journey, as they say. And, my little journey, having done 3 years in the government, and Geoff can attest to this, having seen government up close, that when you're in government, you're almost like a hamster on a wheel. You're just running every day on the agenda of the day. Opposition is a different thing. Opposition is a moment of reflection. Opposition is very cathartic and very important process for people who have been in government to go through what they did, to learn lessons, where they've made mistakes, what would they have done differently. But also philosophically, to really get straight in your head, what do you stand for and what you're trying to achieve? And that process for me was obviously in energy. And as I was given this brief in the opposition front bench on energy in the Lords, with a brief to sort of peel the onion, as it were, and find out what we'd done to ourselves over the last 14 years, even me, that I would consider reasonably well informed, was actually pretty shocked at what I found, right? What did we actually do this to ourselves? Did we actually, Conservative government, give ourselves the most expensive energy in the OECD? 7 times more expensive than China, 4 times more expensive than the US, deindustrialization on a massive scale, importing oil from gas from Norway, from fields over the fence from the ones we were shutting down, etc. And I guess the point then is that I was been in opposition. That was the first thing, looking at what we did in government. And then from a Scottish point of view, I was able to spend a lot more time focusing on Scottish matters, living in Edinburgh, working in Edinburgh, being able to do that, and getting a good look at what the Scottish Conservative offering was for Holyrood 26. And what I discovered was lacking ambition, lacking vision, lacking any plan for government. And that was disappointing to find. And therefore, if you care about it, what are you going to do? You've got to do something about it. Scotland needs a centre-right alternative. It needs a centre-right narrative. Scottish Conservatives have given up. Therefore, Reform UK is the platform to advocate that centre-right narrative.
Some would suggest that Reform UK are not centre-right, that they are perceived as actually being further right, way out on the right, in fact. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, this is all sort of language. How do you define right, left, upside down? I mean, the reality is that we have had in Scotland 25 years of, we've discussed this before, 25 years of basically social democratic government, which is basically favours state intervention, state spending. Any problem should be solved by the state as opposed to by individuals. That's the left philosophy. The right philosophy is personal responsibility. People want to look after themselves, their families, their communities, create the conditions for them to do that, and they will look after themselves better. You can then go left or right further from that. I would say that reform is not, from my experience of the party, is not far right at all. It is actually sitting right in the space of saying that people want a better society, want better communities, want more control over their own lives, and that they want to therefore have a more fulfilling life in that what I'd call centre-right space.
And do you think then, with that in mind, that Reform UK has something solid to offer to the people of Scotland? Is that clear to you and to voters right now, what they are saying, what the package deal is?
I think actually there's a conversation happening here, slightly symbiotic a wee bit, which is that there is a movement within Scotland on the ground, a hunger for change, for that alternative narrative, finding that was not available from the Scottish Conservative Party. Therefore, that movement is demanding an alternative. Reform UK is philosophically in that space. Danny Kruger is a big influence in my decision to move to reform. He is effectively, I think, a philosopher MP. He's very based, his whole philosophy is based on family, community, country. That is the space that Reform UK occupies. What we have the opportunity to do as the Scottish version of Reform UK is make that a very Scottish concept. These are effectively Scottish concepts: family, community, country. That is what we would all believe in. So therefore, we are in a position to shape that narrative, and that will and do that on an interactive basis with what the grassroots are telling us.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because I have to say one of the perceptions of Nigel Farage is he doesn't know much about Scotland,
and he wouldn't pretend otherwise, Calum. He didn't come up to Falkirk, and he actually said very little in Falkirk. Actually, he doesn't pretend otherwise. He would actually say that he's born and bred in London, right? He's a Londoner. That's what he is. But he is, the clue is in the name. Reform UK is a UK party. It's a UK movement. But he's not going to come up here and try and pretend to be more Scottish than he's not. That is why the party needs a Scottish voice.
Malcolm, do you think, I don't mean this pejoratively at all, because I don't think there's any difference in being a Scottish nationalist or a Welsh nationalist or an Irish nationalist, but do you think that Farage is an English nationalist as well as being comfortable in the UK?
I mean, I've heard this said, and we've talked about this again before, because you might say that there is an English narrative that says, well, hang on, the Welsh have got their parliament, the Scots have got their parliament, Northern Irish have got, well, why is there not an English parliament, right? And then there was English votes for English laws, etc., etc. I have to say that having lived in London for 25 years, up until 2014, I've now been back in Scotland for 12 years, but still going up and down to London. I don't hear that narrative very often, actually, from English people from London. I don't really hear that very much. I don't think that's a pressing issue, actually. At the end of the day, England is 85% of the population of the UK, 90% of the wealth, right? So England, by definition, does dominate the United Kingdom, but it's plainly obvious that what devolution has done, or was designed to do, was to counteract that, by giving the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish more direct autonomy over their own home day-to-day affairs.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting just hearing Malcolm speak, and obviously you've been in the podcast fairly recently anyway, and I think that, I guess, we all sensed, and listeners I'm sure sensed as well, that you were restless might be the word. I think maybe even agitated was probably the word, actually, from a policy perspective. I think one interesting thing though, and look, I'll be honest, I have concerns about reform. I have concerns about Farage. It's probably a different conversation. But what I would say is that, Malcolm and I have spent quite a bit of time together over the last few months, actually, on the series of papers that Malcolm launched, which were really cross-party papers, Wealthy Nation, Healthy Nation, that I was helping with professionally. And in all the conversations I had with Malcolm, I didn't hear the word immigration mentioned. I didn't hear the word crime mentioned. I didn't hear the word Brexit mentioned. You talked about the NHS a bit. You talked about education a bit more. You talked about the economy a lot. And you talked about work pretty much all the time. So I do think it's an interesting vehicle for Malcolm, because the things that we perceive reform to be talking about a lot, I've never heard you talk about them at all. So I think it's interesting from that point of view. I mean, is that a fair reflection, do you think?
Well, if you take the concept of family, community, and country, family is the bedrock of any communities, and so family values would be, we would consider those to be core Scottish values, okay? And then we want to build healthy communities, and that means cohesive communities. And then we want to feel proud in our country, right? Now, the reality is that anybody who wants to be in our country, as long as they fall into those common values, there's no issue. We don't need to talk about where they come from or who they are, because we're all united by that. We only have to talk about this when there are different values and we've got communities that are not cohesive. So, in my view on this is that work is the key to this. Work is the best route out of poverty. We've got the balance wrong between welfare and work, and a country that works will be a happy country. And people who work together have to interact together and have to be tolerant of each other and have to understand each other's values and have to share those values. And so, for me, as long as people who come to this country want to work, be net contributors, not net takers, want to learn our language and live in our country and share our values, that is great. That is all. The conversation for me is only around the concept of community for me, and that is about community, prosperity, and cohesion. That's the only time I want to talk about that subject.
Geoff?
Well, lots of things. I'll try and focus my comments. Firstly, I want to say I said a couple of weeks from the podcast that the one thing Reform UK was missing was a credible Scottish figurehead, and without blowing too much smoke up his backside, I think they've now found that, because whatever one thinks about Malcolm Offord's politics, he has a Scottish success story behind him, and will be able to speak to the things that he's just done on the podcast eloquently, and it gives them a platform that hitherto they don't have and haven't had. And that was going to be Nigel Farage's biggest weakness, because as we've already discussed and confirmed, he doesn't know Scotland. And so should the election take place with Malcolm Offord on debates, that would worry me if I was particularly Russell Finlay and probably Anna Sarwar. Less so George Swinney, although I would still think he'll be having a wee thought about how he deals with this. So that's the niceties out of the way, but let's get into some of the meat. So I'm very interested that you said energy was one of the reasons that you have decided to make this defection, Malcolm. I just want to talk a little bit about that. I agree with your comments on oil and gas, unsurprisingly. I think it's nothing short of a disgrace what's going on just now. So needless as well. But I was very concerned about Richard Tice, your UK deputy leader, when he said, and he sent a formal notice to all CEOs of major energy companies saying that a reform government would seek to terminate all contracts for difference signed under the upcoming allocation round, AR7. Now that's for offshore wind. Offshore wind is a £96.1 billion market for us, particularly the projects around Scotland. That's just the projects around Scotland, 27 gigawatts. What is your policy on that, Malcolm? Because fundamentally, if investors believe that you're going to strike down all those contracts, which is essentially subsidies, which I agree with, by the way, to get a nascent technology undergoing, what message does that send to offshore wind investors? What does that send about the future economy of Scotland?
Well, okay, let's get right into this. I mean, we've had wind farms around our shores now for about 30 years, okay? And they have been assisted by the taxpayer through contracts for difference effectively. And that's the result of why, that's now why when households look at their household bills, only 1/3 of those household bills is actually the cost of energy. 2/3 are all the green levies, all the grid upgrades, and all the contracts for difference, etc. Right? Now, the public were told that this was going to become the cheapest energy available to them, and that it was a bit like a child becoming an adolescent, becoming an adult. They would grow up and they'd be weaned off subsidies and they'd become merchant viable. So 30 years later, they're still not merchant viable. And then we're being told that the British government's about to sign another 20-year contracts on something which isn't merchant viable. Okay, so something's gone wrong there. I absolutely believe that we should have a clean and balanced energy system. The cleaner work, by the way, balance is important, a balanced scorecard, right? Because when you look at what's going on with China, China's got 30% of its energy system now renewables. They're getting a lot of plaudits for what they're doing, but what you don't talk about is 70% of it comes from burning coal. And they're opening a coal-fired power station 1 a week, and they're using coal as their transition fuel to creating a cleaner energy system. The US is using shale gas as a transition fuel to a cleaner energy system. We should be using gas, North Sea gas, on our own shores as our transition fuel. But by cutting that off and having to import it very expensively from whether it's Norway or US, and at the same time subsidizing wind farms that don't ever seem to become merchant viable, we've got ourselves in a mess. Now, the lawyers will have a point of view on whether a sovereign state can just cancel contracts over 20 years. I think the point of that letter was more to put people on notice, to say, this can't go on. We have to find a way to making wind, if it's going to be in our system, it has to become merchant viable. And we can't just keep it on a life support system for 50 years. So I think this is a moving space, Geoff, and I think that letter was written with as a heads up, effectively, to say we're going to look seriously at this. And again, take the politics out of it. We need to have an energy system which is clean, but also needs to be affordable, which is not at the moment. And so, when I looked at when I say that's part of my journey looking at energy, I said, did we really do that to ourselves? But then in opposition, you could say, well, is that an aberration? Was it only energy? But then you look across the waterfront of Conservatives over 14 years, and you look at things like, our welfare system has gone wrong. Our taxation and borrowing is the highest it's been since the Second World War. Our immigration is out of control and at record levels. There's too many areas. There's too many areas where things have gone demonstrably wrong. And I think that the context for me picking up energy was that's the start of my journey. But then looking across all other areas, you see things have gone demonstrably wrong.
Sure, and I understand that, and a lot of what you say, I don't necessarily disagree with, but I think the point I'm getting at is you can understand, we agree that oil and gas positioning is pretty poor just now, and I hope the UK government, I really hope it will change it. I don't know if anyone saw Keir Starmer's remarks last week where he didn't actually understand the windfall tax. Quite extraordinary.
I know, that was shocking.
Quite extraordinary. He was actually arguing for what we're all arguing for, put in place a mechanism that is fair right now, but he didn't seem to understand what was going on just now. So I hope he takes time to reflect on that. But you can understand my concern. You have a situation where Reform's leading in the polls at the UK. In about 2 years' time, before the next, another 2 years before the next general election, wind investors are going to go, bugger this, I'm getting out of the market. At the same time, we're undergoing the vast and needless, deceleration of oil and gas. Scotland could be caught in an absolute hiatus, which is going to cost thousands of jobs and put us in a perilous position. So what I'm asking you is, would you at least consult with your UK leadership and say, hold on a bit here. Okay, it might not be that we have to go through the same CFD process we just discussed, but we cannot send a message to investors, because presumably that's the last thing you want to do, Malcolm, and say, right, you're no welcome here. We need to get, you said balance. Yeah. We need a balanced approach to this, and that's been sorely lacking from all political parties, in my opinion.
Yes, look. The one thing I learned on energy is it's complicated. There's not a silver bullet. There's not an easy solution. People say, just go fracking. Well, that doesn't work in the UK for all sorts of geological reasons, quite apart from the politics of it. So, at the end of the day, we've got. You say that we're losing jobs. We're losing jobs at the moment. 1,000 jobs a week in the northeast. This transition we were told about, where technical jobs would go from the rigs, the oil and gas to the wind farms. OE UK put out a stat saying it's only running at 58% transition, and the jobs are at 2/3 of the salaries. Okay, how do you feel about the fact that Scotland doesn't produce a single turbine, onshore or offshore? How do you feel about that? Where's that great green economy gone? We're not getting any benefit for that. Right now, if you were to say to me, so what's happened here is that the grid system was built in the 50s and 60s on a triangle where, because the power was produced in Scunthorpe in coal-fired power stations, and it was taken to the south to the conurbations, the big conurbations, right? By the time it got to Lewis, up where Calum lives, that's the most expensive place to send it, and that's why it was more expensive to go up north, right? And the idea of a national grid was a bit like the health service, which is you get the same services in Stornoway as you get in Streatham, and so that's why everything gets equaled out, right? Now you're building a system where all the power has been taken in the most remote areas. It's been taken from around Stornoway and Lewis and Orkney, etc., and it's got to go south to London, right? Or to Birmingham or to Manchester, wherever it might have to go. Now, that needs a new grid. So you need to build a new grid to bring it all down. Now, if you said to me, oh, well, the good news about that is we can shut down the old grid because we're going to build a new grid for wind. But that's not what's happening, because you can't shut down the old grid because sometimes the wind doesn't blow and sometimes the sun doesn't shine. And then you need gas as your backup. So I'm just saying there has to be a common sense way of doing this. We've created a bit of a Ponzi scheme. It looks to me like there's some people profiteering here. There's some big corporations making a lot of money out of this, Geoff, while people's bills are not going down. You could argue that this is the biggest transfer of money from poor people to rich people that we've seen in a generation. There's something not right about that, okay? So I think that we've got to grasp the nettle here, and the public want a new solution from somebody thinking at it from a clean slate, as opposed to somebody saying, oh, really sorry, we got that wrong, we're going to change our minds now,
I'll tell you what's interesting there is one of the things the Tories have suffered from for the whole of 25 years is that they are run by London. Okay, that is a massive problem. They've never been able to say to the Scottish people credibly that they are there for Scotland first. It just hasn't happened. Nobody believes them. Nobody ever will. And the conversation we've just had, or that Geoff and Malcolm have just had, revolves around something that Richard Tice, somebody in London for reform, has said that could actually cause Malcolm and the Scottish outfit some quite significant problems. So I suppose the question that raises in my mind, I mean, I've said before...
Sorry. Andy, sorry, your signal's coming and going, so I've just tweaked a setting here that will hopefully help it. Can you just give that another run for us, please?
Yeah, is it sounding better now?
Yeah,
sounding
it
any
should
better?
be. Yeah, go for it.
Right. I'll tell you what's interesting there is that just listening to that conversation with Geoff and Malcolm, the problem the Scottish Tories have had for the entirety of devolution is that they are effectively run by London. Nobody really credibly believes that they have a Scotland first approach because they're always looking to Westminster. And the interesting thing about that conversation, of course, is that Geoff has introduced something there to Malcolm that is a problem that started in London with letters from Richard Tice. Now, I think one of the big tests here is whether or not Malcolm can actually, on behalf of the Scottish part of Reform UK, go to London and say, guys, you're going to have to change this because this doesn't work for me. Now, when Scottish Tory leaders have said that, London have said, forget it, don't care, not interested. Will this be different in this party, I wonder? Because, Malcolm, you talk about the economy a lot, you talk about work a lot. You can't talk about these things without talking about the renewable energy industry in Scotland because they go hand in hand. So, do you think that it will be different than it was in the Tory party? Can you go down to Farage and say, cut all that stuff out, that doesn't work for me up here, I've got to say something different?
Good question. And actually, the timing on this is going to be quite interesting because if Scotland, if there's a big move to reform in Scotland in May next year, and that's 3 years ahead of Westminster in 29, that gives Reform UK, that means that Reform UK has got its biggest impact, its biggest voice comes from Scotland. You know, who would have predicted that a year ago, right? And so that would give authority. That to me, that would give authority. That gives authority to elected MSPs speaking on behalf of Reform in Scotland to London. But essentially, what you're talking about is how does the UK interact with each other? And it's back to the same old argument that, you know, the reason why we have a pension system covers 65 million people, paid for by 35 million people who work. That is a more secure system for 5.5 million Scots than just being covered from 5 million, 2.8 million people who work. Okay, we have an energy system which is more affordable because we cover it across the whole of the UK. London is a big part of that. Scotland on its own, yes, will be able to generate much more energy than it needs, but it has to get that energy to London, has to be competitive in the market to London, in the southeast, in Birmingham, whatever it is, Manchester. That is where the market is for Scottish energy, right? So at the end of the day, it's a more affordable system if it's run across the 65 million population. That's the reality of it. We need those English consumers effectively subsidising our energy. So there's a conversation to be had on that. That with swings and which is swings and roundabouts, Andy. But I would say that if we've got a voice and we've got a mandate, we've got a strong position here.
So let me just follow up on that then. I mean, that really interesting point, because I think Andy's hit the nail on the head there about how will this work. I think highly likely you will be elected, Malcolm. Let's take ourselves post-election next year. Okay, we'll just stick with our theme here because there's a great example, but this could apply to any issue, right? Transmission charging. You mentioned one of the issues, reasons that English subsidising is because, frankly, Scottish projects, because of the remoteness, gets punished through transmission charging. Would you and John Swinney, assuming he's elected as First Minister, if the polls are to be believed, we're playing fantasy stuff here, I accept, and would you join John Swinney in lobbying the UK government, whether it be Nigel Farage as a future Prime Minister, whether it be Keir Starmer or any other Labour hero, or even Kemi Badenoch, who say this is unfair? I'll stand up for Scotland's energy system, make sure that we get the best deal possible and unlock investment. Would you be willing to do that?
But there's two sides to every coin, Geoff. It's like Newton's second law. Every action is an equal and opposite reaction. The idea the transition charges are too expensive.
Yep.
You say is one issue in the system, but the reality is that this is the most remote form of energy for the UK, right?
No. But you're missing my point, Malcolm. Sorry, you're missing my point. My point is it could be that or any other issue. I'm talking about any other issue. Would you stand alongside John Swinney, sign a joint letter from him and say, right, we're getting this wrong, Mr. Prime Minister. Whoever that Prime Minister, be it your colleague Nigel Farage or indeed Keir Starmer or anyone else, because what Andy's pointing out is the absolute failing point of the UK system. As he says all the time, people down there couldn't care less about what happens in Scotland. Will you be any different?
Right. So if my ambition is, and by leaving Westminster politics and going to Holyrood and making a big statement that that's where I want to be and make impact, what is the reason for that? Because I want to make Scotland the most prosperous part of the United Kingdom. So if that is my litmus test on any issue you put in front of me, Geoff, does this help us make Scotland the most prosperous part of the UK? If I can tick that box, I've delivered what I said I've set out to do. If it doesn't, and there's a problem in London, I go to London with a very strong voice and a very persuasive argument as to why this needs to be changed. And if it doesn't get changed, I can have a row, can't I? But at least I know what I'm having a row about.
Malcolm, a couple of other questions. Geoff mentioned a little while ago about debates in the run-up to the 2026 election. Would you welcome sharing a stage with John Swinney, Anas Sarwar, Russell Finlay, perhaps some of the leaders of other Scottish parties, to debate them yourself, I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's 5 months to the election. And that's a great, that focuses the mind, doesn't it? I mean, it's good to have a timetable. So yeah. Absolutely.
So perhaps on this podcast we could facilitate that sort of coming together. You'd be open to that, and you'd invite the others to join you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. The other part of this that I think is interesting on the kind of Scottish parties, UK parties question is that just last week it was reported in the Financial Times that Nigel Farage was suggesting there will be a deal with the Conservatives before the next general election. Are you open to working with the Scottish Conservatives beyond May 2026?
So that was, I think, that was sort of a hearsay, I'm told, from a donor dinner. That has been flatly denied, and in all the conversations I've had, that is just not talked about, Calum.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's sometimes almost more talked about by the Tories than it is by Reform. Reform has got wind in its sails right now, and certainly in Scotland, having been out and about over the weekend, as I say, meeting the grassroots part of this movement, there is no appetite for that at all. Okay, so who knows? No, I just don't hear that being talked about, and it's certainly not some sort of Machiavellian plan. No way.
Okay, fair enough.
On that, I actually think, to be honest, I think what Nigel Farage is doing is trying to emulate Canada, as I've mentioned before in this podcast, and that doesn't involve merging with the Conservative Party. It involves effectively a reverse takeover because the Conservatives are too weak. I mean, they're not there yet, but that's where he's trying to go. I'll tell you what I do find interesting, though, and it's related. Malcolm, if you get elected here, you're going to be going into a proportional representation parliament, a very different world from Westminster in that you've operated in before. And you're going to be going in with, not you personally, but your party will go into this parliament with a bit of a pariah status, whether you like it or not. I think that probably is what's going to happen, at least at the start of the parliament. What would be your message, do you think, to the other parties, all of the other parties? Are you there to play nice? Are you there to collaborate in the way that PR needs in order to get stuff done? Or do you see yourself more as an agitator?
Well, I mean, I'm not going in there because I'm looking for a job. I'm going in there to make a difference. So therefore, any conversation I have with anybody in that parliament is going to be, is this a good idea for Scotland? And so any policy by policy, I mean, remember, Andy, the parliament was set up, wasn't it? That wasn't meant to have a majority. For whatever reason, Donald Dewar, whatever, set it up that no party would have a majority. So it's meant to be consensual, right? Well, at the moment, we've got consensual only in one direction, which is that we've just splurged a huge amount of cash, as we talked about before. We've gone from 43% of state spending, 43% of GDP to 55%, and we haven't made ourselves better off. We haven't made our hospitals better. We haven't made our schools better. So if I'm going there, I want to have a conversation about how we do things differently. If I'm the only person in this whole parliament who wants to do things differently, well, that you might say, well, you'll be frustrated, Malcolm, you won't get anything done, but you have to start somewhere, haven't you? And you have to pick the issues off one by one, and the public have to understand that what you're doing is actually for their benefit, and we have to win the arguments, but we have to start somewhere, Andy.
Malcolm, it's very good to catch up with you after what has been a frantic weekend. What have you made, by the way, of the reaction to your defection? Generally speaking, I imagine it's been quite a range of responses that you've had.
Yeah, I mean, look, basically on a Saturday, my phone melted. So I basically just switched it off and then opened up again later on Saturday evening. Look, no word of a lie, 90% of the messages I have on my phone are supportive, which is higher than I thought it would be.
Fair enough. I suppose we have to finish on a question on independence, Malcolm. The last time you were on the podcast, your comments around independence ignited something of a discussion and debate, particularly online. I think we're probably in the territory now, based on polling and based on the proximity of the Scottish parliamentary election, that I have to ask whether you would respect an SNP majority, as is John Swinney's strategy, for calling for a second independence referendum. Would you consider that the Scottish Parliament having earned the right to a second independence referendum?
I know there was a lot of reaction to that phrase, earn the right, wasn't there?
Quite a bit.
Yeah. Look, so John Swinney set himself. He's set himself a couple of tests. Obviously, one is getting a majority in Parliament, but the other thing was he used that phrase, compelling and demonstrable support. If there was compelling and demonstrable support for a referendum. And we know that in 2014 there was So in 2014 there was a majority for the SNP, and there was, however you define it, compelling and demonstrable support for a referendum. Okay, so Swinney set himself that test. If you're saying to me on the precise issue of a majority in Holyrood, that certainly would improve their position.
Understood. Malcolm Offord, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. Great to speak to you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Right, that's Lord Malcolm Offord, soon to be just Malcolm Offord, actually. Of course, he'll be running as an MSP for Reform UK. And I mean, he said over the weekend, Geoff, that it's, there's a kind of process to be done when it comes to who's going to be their Scottish leader. It would be kind of bizarre if it wasn't him at this point, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I made the assumption that he would be. I'm guessing that is the big plan here. Yeah, look, people might disagree with what I'm about to say, and that's their right. But I just don't think you can deny the fact the guy is credible, and he's a very good communicator. And as I repeat again, the one thing missing from Farage's armoury in Scotland was a credible leader. They now probably have that. Because I just don't think Farage would be able to make the inroads once you got into the cut and thrust of a debate. Malcolm Offord can, because he understands Scotland a lot better than his UK party leader, as Malcolm accepted. So it does change things. I suppose what I'm really interested to understand is, I think it's probably a given that this is a bad day or bad development for the Scottish Conservatives. How bad a day is it for Anna Sarwar? I think only time will tell. I would imagine he's a wee bit worried as well. Here's another credible person I'm going to have to stand up to and take votes from. Now, the interesting thing to me is, what does it do to the SNP vote? Any credible alternative as in terms of an individual is a worry, but I suspect perhaps that John Swinney's less concerned than the other two that I've mentioned. Fascinating to see how this one unfolds.
It really is. And I think to build on that, Andy, the key thing here is about, I suppose, how much of a platform Reform UK in Scotland get between now and the election. And presumably this ramps up in the new year in January. Because right now it's been a sort of success here and there in by-elections, whether at local council level, the Hamilton by-election, where they kind of performed so well that they were kind of the second part of that story. It's about the platform that Reform UK can build and how loud they can be about it over the next few months.
And that platform is important for them and for him. I mean, look, let's be honest, right? Nobody in the country knows who Malcolm Offord is. Okay? Nobody in the country knows who a lot of our politicians are, but they don't know who Malcolm Offord is. He's not been elected. He's not been an MSP. And I don't think Malcolm Offord as an individual will be able to make much of a mark until just before the election, if there are these debates. And then it will really be after the election, if he is the leader of the Reform Party in Scotland, and he communicates in the way that he's communicated with us and with others over the last little while, that'll be his opportunity to make his mark. So at the moment, it's more a case of, does the party's polling hold up well enough to get him in? I think it's after that things become the most interesting for me. Because if I look back, I mean, I've been involved with what you might call the centre-right for a quarter of a century, and David McCletchie had vision, but it was just never the right time for him to do anything about it. Murdo Fraser had a lot of vision in 2011 of this sort, but the party didn't want him in their wisdom. And then Malcolm Offord. I mean, I've not heard vision like this from a kind of centre-right liberal perspective for a very, very long time. And he's got it. Now, I have doubts as to whether Reform's the right platform for that vision. I've got to be honest. I've got substantial doubts about his party, but I don't have any doubts about him. I've got to be honest.
Can I just come back on that, though? Andy, you make a very good point. I mean, actually, his biggest weakness in this whole campaign could be Reform UK, ironically enough, his colleagues doing south. That he's going to have to end up defending because by virtue of the fact he's now chosen to defect. But one thing I'd challenge you on slightly is, and this comes back to actually who's around him, who's his advisors, who's coming up with the strategy. But I mean, if I was advising him, I'd be just making him the focal point from now until polling day. Anytime there is a media interview, get him on. All he needs is exposure. So, for our listeners' benefit, up until Purdah, when Parliament goes into recess for the election, opportunities for profile will be, thin on the ground, actually, and you have to take every opportunity you get. Again, I put him up every time to get him that profile. But after that, he will be afforded an opportunity because the media, broadcast media, has to show a degree of balance in terms of its coverage. And that will afford him opportunity. And if he gets on to the debates, then he has that kind of platform to again raise his profile ahead of the election. So it's really important that his advisors are on that because that will give him that chance. Final point is really linked to the election itself. If Reform are in a position of influence in the Scottish Parliament, that will change things quite demonstrably in terms of how we view Reform UK, because whether we like it or not, and I agree with Andy, I have deep suspicion about Reform UK, and we still don't know exactly what they stand for beyond a couple of key issues. That will change things massively in terms of how we approach this party, because once they're elected and the people have elected them, they're in there legitimately and they have to be dealt with. And I think the other parties have to think, how do we tackle this? Do we just do the name calling bit or do we try and take them on the substance? I would argue the latter, because the former hasn't worked so far.
Yeah. Andy, have we so far skipped over the sort of one of the most obvious criticisms of the makeup of Reform UK, both at UK level and now at Scotland level, which is it is made up of a bunch of people who have jumped ship from the Conservatives, and so the obvious attack is vote Reform, you just get the same old Tories.
I think to a degree that is right, and I think strategically if I was Reform I'd want defections from other parties, not just the Tories, but realistically, at least in the short term, it is going to be mainly from the Tories. I think what I would say though is that if the experiences of Canada is anything to go by, and if you look at some of the sort of people who have defected, they are Tories, but they're Tories who are leaving because they've got different ideas than the ones the Tories have. And I think that ultimately is what is going to make the difference here. If the platform of the party is substantially different to the platform of the Tory party, then that will play out in the longer term to their advantage, most likely.
Andy and Geoff, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you for jumping on for a special recording this morning. And thank you, of course, to Malcolm Offord for joining us too. Your reactions are very welcome. We'll read these out on Wednesday's episode. Email us hello@holyroodsources.com. Is this a game changer as far as you're concerned? You can get in touch with us, of course, as well on WhatsApp as you're listening. The number is 0333 404 6507. Drop us a message. We'd like loads of these for Wednesday. Your reaction to Malcolm Offord's defection. Is he now a credible potential leader in Scotland for Reform UK. Thanks so much for listening today. We will talk to you again on Wednesday.